Let's talk about doppelgangers. Welcome to my channel. I focus on tabletop role-playing games, video games, and science fiction. Doppelgangers have been in Dungeons & Dragons since AD&D or first edition of Dungeons & Dragons. I didn't find any reference to them in original Dungeons & Dragons. I may have missed it, but I didn't find any. So they were introduced in the first edition. The interesting Doppelganger is has got an interesting feature I don't think any other creature has, where the spelling of the name changed. The first edition and second edition used Doppel, D-O-P-P-L-E, and the third through the fifth used Doppel, with D-O-P-P-E-L, Ganger. So the third through the fifth, it follows the conventional spelling, and it was misspelled in the first and second editions. The first edition also had an interesting little note. Note, a doppelganger actually forms itself into the likeness of the clothing and equipment of the imitated creature, as well as the physical features thereof. Which is interesting because that wasn't repeated in any other edition. But in the first edition, when a doppelganger assumed the form, it also assumed all the equipment, which I think is an interesting feature. I really like this about the first edition doppelganger, because it makes them much more able to imitate the disguise. They can look like somebody, and it's not a matter of disguising and just taking on the facial features. They actually take on the entire shape. The second edition removed this, and they changed the drawing of the second edition a bit. They're always described as tall and thin, with very gaunt looking and gray or almost pupilless eyes. Then we get to the third edition, and now we've changed the name, and we're looking a little different again, but much of the attributes are the same. Again, we don't have this thing about taking on the equipment also of it's only in the first edition. And the fourth edition continues on with the same thing. Then we get to the fifth edition. We have a note in the fifth edition. Doppelgangers are too lazy or self-interested to raise their young. They assume attractive male forms and to seduce women, leaving them to raise their progeny. A doppelganger child appears to be a normal member of its mother's species until it reaches adolescence, at which point it discovers its true nature and is driven to seek out its kind to join them. This is the first mention in any of the books about the reproduction of doppelgangers. And I don't like this one, and I'll explain why. Because if you can take on the form of something else, that means that you can take on the form no matter what they're wearing or what they're not wearing. As we know, anybody who's watched a James Bond movie know that sex is an interesting part of all spy-type novels and things like that. You always have the interest of sex. So wouldn't it make sense that a doppelganger be the ultimate spy, like Mata Hari or something, where you can seduce the men and get the secrets, or you could seduce the women and get the secrets? So a doppelganger should be able to change genders. Otherwise, they have a real problem in being able to merge in, because they actually change genders. Which brings up an interesting movie. There's a movie that was released called Society, and I'll put several links about it down in the description below. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's not a great film, don't get me wrong, but it has some interesting features that make you think that these creatures, which are there, are a form of doppelganger. They take on some of the attributes and how they eat and so on, but they're not the classical doppelganger that's described in Dungeons and Dragons, but it gives you some interesting concepts about the sex life of that. Now, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons and I was running the World of Tiglath campaign, and we were playing with 4th edition rules before this 5th edition note came out. And this topic came up because the party was going through a dungeon I call Nolomendati, and which had been a doppelganger stronghold, is the easiest way and shortest way to describe it. But you ran across, best way to say it is doppelganger porn. So in the doppelganger porn that the players ran across, there was an interesting thing about, there was a pejorative that the doppelgangers used for non-doppelgangers as of one face. They referred to humans and elves and dwarves as just one faces, because we don't change our face. We just have one face. Where they were multi-faces, they changed it. And you had this description, sometimes descriptions about seducing one faces and things like that. But they also had, shall we say, sexual encounters with each other. And this brings up an interesting question: is sexual encounter between two doppelgangers, which, if they can take on either gender, what does this mean? Now, this gets into those ones, people who say there's only two genders, and which is what I believe, but I put in with exceptions. And one of them, you do have people who they're very small number, well less than 1%, generally like 1,000th of 1% of people, I'd have to look up the actual numbers, who are actually born hermaphroditic, who actually are born with both kinds of genitals. Or you run into the ones who had various problems, who have they're male genetically, but they didn't develop so that they look sexually, they look like females, but they're actually male, and they have undescended testes in the place where ovaries would be, but they're actually testes. So you do run into a small number that are that, but doppelgangers fall into this group that, the way I played them, was that they could assume either gender, and they could assume either gender as part of their reproduction. Now, if any of you have ever read Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, this is also a similar type race. So it's not completely outside the realm of what's out there. Left Hand of Darkness describes the situation on an alien world where the species can be male for a period of time, then switch to female, have children, then switch back to male and father some others. This is more what I would envision of doppelgangers. But then it gets back to Society, which is the film, and that opens up some truly, if you think about the things that go on in that film, that could they actually be part of the doppelganger features there. And it just gets really, it gives you some really weird and unusual approaches to the doppelganger as a monster. So the doppelganger has been around since the first edition. He's went through a bunch of changes, and I like the first edition statement where that they actually created the equipment as part of their disguise, that they actually became part of the doppelganger. And I dislike the change that they add to the 5th edition, which basically says that all doppelgangers are male, because assume attractive male forms. Well, because they seduce women so that they bear their children, as opposed to you don't see doppelganger females, which they're now. who else has had doppelgangers in your campaign? I'd like to hear stories about where you've had them, where you've fought them, what happens with them, what do you think about, do they have one gender, multiple genders? Are they all male? Do they have female? How do they reproduce? This gets into interesting questions. I'd like to hear what you think about that. Thank you for watching my video. I look forward to learning what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. I appreciate all your comments. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, give me a thumbs down. I appreciate both forms of feedback. If you're new here and would like to subscribe, you can click on the icon on the left. If you're interested, there's more content on the right.